Hello and welcome to the lecture of International Business Environment. In this lecture we will going to discuss about Unit 10, that is Multilateral Trading Systems, which is Unit 10 of Block 3. So as topics which we will going to be covered are Introduction, Establishment of WTO, Uruguay Round Agreement, Multilateral Trade Agreement and Polylateral Trade Agreement. Now if we talk about the multilateral trade agreement, the very basic thing was going to be discussed, that what is basically the GATT and yes, what is WTO. If we talk about the GATT, GATT is basically a general agreement on the tariffs and trades. Basically this is created for the right practices in the international businesses. The main and the mandatory function is to have a smooth functioning of an overseas international trade in goods, and yes, at the same time they bringing out in the liberalization of the trades also by minimizing the tariffs and non-tariff barriers. So GATT is basically founded in 1947 with 23 members with them. So there are various methodology was used at that time to liberalize all the practices and have a proper negotiation and instrument for negotiations in that particular international trade. So GATT actually played a very important role in the international practices, and when we talk about GATT, yes, it's basically having all the regulations regarding the international practices. When we said all the regulations, so yes, there must be reviews and the changes and the modifications in that particular rules and regulation. In the 21st century, as the trade was upbringing and trade was changed, scenario was changed. So in that change scenario, in that changing patterns of trade, so there was requirement of new and different practices in the international trade. With the demand of that particular new and reviews and revised policies of that international trade, there was we can say that the one of the new organization, that is WTO, that is establishment. So we can in a very straight manner say that WTO is a successor of a general agreement of tariffs and trade. So it's a successor of GATT. This is what basically consisted of 153 members, whereas GATT is just only consisted by 23 members, and this is consisted in 1995. The main purpose is to bringing out more liberalization in the international trade. With that more liberalization in international trade, and a country can have a better practices and they have a more good scope to have a good practice in that international trade. And yes, at the same time they are basically designed and they basically supervise the international trade. So we can हम बहुत ही सिंपल मैनर्स में ये कह सकते हैं कि WTO ने एक सक्सेशन था जनरल अग्रीमेंट ऑफ टेरिफ्स एंड ट्रेड का, एंड यस इसकी हेल्प से एक नई इम्प्रूवमेंट्स आई थी ट्रेड प्रैक्टिसेस में, इंटरनेशनल ट्रेड प्रैक्टिसेस में, उसकी स्मूथ वर्किंग के लिए, उसके डिजाइंस के लिए, एंड दे इंक्लूड होल वर्ल्ड इन दैट इंटरनेशनल ट्रेड, that all are the contributions of WTO which actually performed. Now if we talk about the World Trade Organization basically headquartered in the Switzerland, and yes, they have 3 different levels to be performed. The very first is the ministerial conferences, that is the first, which is having meeting after every 2 years or within that particular 2 years. Then after that ministerial conferences, there are general councils. General councils basically taken care of all the day-to-day administrative activities. After that general council, there was a director general. Director generals have all the appointments by the ministerial conferences dealing with all the factors. So that is what the 3-level working of WTO. Now if we talk about GATT and WTO, what are those major differences between those two? As we already discussed that GATT is basically we can say that successor of a GATT is WTO. WTO is another extension of a GATT, and yes, WTO basically contains an improvement version of the original GATT. GATT is basically deals with only with the goods, but while adding the services in it, while adding the intellectual property right in it, WTO comes into a practice. That means WTO is basically the extension of that world trade, which comes with the practices of all the goods and services and all the IPR trade and practices. And yes, at the same time, this is what for the betterment of handling of the disputes part, where the GATT was dispute panel finding of often belongs there just to minimize that dispute. There was a block of that information and of that panel findings, but in WTO the members cannot block the decisions which is arrived in that particular mechanisms. So these are the major difference. And yes, there is a difference of a contribution. In GATT is only 23 countries participated in, whereas in WTO the whole world 153 countries are participated in that particular organization. And yes, they deal with all different package of agreements. There are different packages in WTO with the different products and services, whereas in GATT they just allow a negotiation between that two parties. So this is one of the major again a difference. अगर इन दोनों के डिफरेंस की बात करें तो अपार्ट फ्रॉम कि हाँ GATT सिर्फ प्रोडक्ट की ट्रेडिंग की बात करता था और WTO ने प्रोडक्ट सर्विस और IPRs प्रॉपर्टीज को भी एक कंक्लूडिव और ट्रेडेबल आइटम्स माना. एंड यस एट द सेम टाइम जहां पर GATT सिर्फ दो पार्टीज के बीच में नेगोशिएशन के बेसिस पर अग्रीमेंट बनाता था, वहीं पर WTO is working on the unified package of that agreement. That means predefined package of all these agreement, और उन्हीं बेसिस पर हर कंट्री परफॉर्म करती है. So these all two are the major differences which are comes into these two practices. As we discussed that yes, there are a large number of potential members in the WTO, and वो potential members ने WTO की practices को और strengthen किया है. And yes, at the same time they bring out a good contributions at the international trade. If we talk about the function of WTO, the very first function is the provide a forum for the trade liberalization and negotiation. Yes, WTO basically helps to bringing out into the negotiation, bringing out the liberalization practices in the international trade. They actually help us. They are basically a government forums who bringing out the practices of the liberalization and negotiation. The second one is the administrator, the new dispute settlement procedures. They have their own dispute settlement procedures between the parties, and yes, how to resolve it, and there was no full rules and regulations of dealing with that kind of conflicts and disputes. At the same time, establish and direct a trade policy review mechanism. So this is the trade policy review mechanism, that is TPRM, that is trade policy review mechanism, is basically having a purpose to bringing out the right practices in the international trade, bringing out the proper discipline and proper rules in the that particular organization, which is followed by all the parties of that particular organization. So that is what the role of TPRM. At the same time, bringing out the corporate fully with the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. That is what to link the and yes, having a proper coordination with two major financial factors, or we can say the financial organizations of the nation. That is what comes into International Monetary Fund and World Bank. So International Monetary Fund और World Bank जो है वो वर्ल्ड वाइड फाइनेंसिंग को देखते हैं, सो फाइनेंशियल फैक्टर्स को कंसीडर करते हैं, सो उनके साथ एक प्रॉपर कोऑर्डिनेशन इज द फंक्शन ऑफ WTO. Now, as you see in the slide, this is what the structure of WTO. The structure of WTO is basically having three levels which we previously discussed, that is ministerial conferences, general councils and director general. So general councils have a responsibility of all dispute settlement bodies, and yes, at the same time trade policy review body. So they all have their workings in the trade in goods, trade in service, for trade related aspects of intellectual rights. They again, yes, at the same time trade policy review body have the same functionings, and yes, at the same time there are director general who reports to general council regarding the issue, and below the director generals there are secretariats of WTO. So this all comes into the overall structure of WTO. Ministerial conferences is basically the ultimate authority, and they have a full authority of all that functioning of WTO in the multilateral trade agreements. They taken care of all that decisions and conceiving all those factors. They are, we can say that in short, the chief policy making of WTO. Whereas the General Council, which have a responsibilities of all dispute settlements and all review mechanisms. So in that case, yes, there are representative of each member, and they retain the overall responsibilities of all these councils. So these are three main councils which is taken by General Council. In the General Councils, yes, there are three main functions which is performed, as we see in the structure of that WTO also. The very first is the dispute settlement body. This is what the body who taken care all the disputes and all the conflict arises between the parties, and how to resolve that dispute in a very ethical manner, in proper rules and regulations of WTO. That is what the principal functioning of General Council. Second principle of General Council is to administrate the trade policy review mechanism. That is what the taking care of all the rules and regulation, all the disciplinaries are maintained and performed by the countries who are the member of WTO. So हर member सही से perform करेगा, उसकी taken care भी General Councils करते हैं. Then to supervise and ensure that smooth running of the councils of the trade in goods, service and yes in the property products. So जितनी भी trade प्रोडक्शंस हैं गुड्स के साथ सर्विस के साथ जो डील कर रहे हैं वो स्मूथली हो रही हैं. सो दीज ऑल कम्स इनटू प्रिंसिपल्स ऑफ फंक्शनिंग. सो द जनरल काउंसिल अगेन डेलीगेट्स द वर्क टू द थ्री पार्ट. The very three parts are the director council who taken care of consist of all those members. Director councils में सब वो members आते हैं जो अपने अपने respective areas में काम कर रहे होते हैं. Then trade in a goods, trade in a service and yes trade related to the API. That they are the three main bodies जिसके अंदर हम trade practices कर सकते हैं. So हर practices पर सही से काम करना है, and yes the General Council delegates this responsibility to these three bodies. Now the Uruguay round agreement is again a very important agreement out of the 8 agreements of GATT. GATT के 8 rounds हुए थे, and in that after 7th round the Uruguay round is the one of the 8th round, and it's in the last round of it. In 1982 ministerial declaration basically identified a one problem. That problem is that the structure must be renewed, and yes there are the n number of deficiencies. There are negative impacts of the policies on the world trade. So how to minimize this negative impacts on that international trade, how to manage that policies? For that there were the Uruguay round was conducted and launched on 1986. In this round all the discussions are happened regarding the international trades and conflict, and all the deficiencies are basically discussed in this round. They basically negotiate on the trade basis. They negotiate in the service and intellectual property. They discussed about कि yes there must be in a certain provisions for the service and for the intellectual property. अगर इन पर provisions होंगी तो it will be more easy to countable these factor in the trade also. And yes, at the same time they negotiate on the extent of trading systems into these several new areas. They basically worked out that how we can enlarge our trading functions and bringing out the proper trade system in the international trade. And yes, at the same time all the original GATT articles were up to reviewed, and every article required to be renewed, required to be considered and modified. So that was comes into the negotiation. And yes, at the same time they basically discuss about the very sensible factors or sensitive areas basically, that is agriculture and textile. So these are all the factors which are negotiated in that round, and they are finally conclude about the establishmenting of all the legal bindings of dispute resolutions. हर dispute को settle करने के लिए एक legal bindings बनाई जाएंगी, एक legal functionings बनाई जाएंगी जिसके अंदर हर member को perform करना होगा. And yes, at the same time they are supplemented by the number of the other agreements on the issues, so they can work and trade on regarding that rules and regulations. So these all are what the major discussions which are discussed in the Uruguay round agreement. Now what are the major goal of that round? The very first goal of that round is to liberalize the trade, reduce that. Yes, GATT work on the reductions of a trades or non-tariff barriers. They basically put out the certain solutions for that, but again they are not as successful. So in that case, in that round, the decision or the member of that particular round become more liberalized to bringing out international trade practices in a very right manner. Then properly reflects the modern development in the world trade, bringing out, yes, the international trade or that world trade helps to bringing out that development, reflects the proper functionings of it. That is the another goal. And yes, bringing out or exempted all the rules of GATT and come up with the new rules and regulations. That is the another major goal of the round. That is the 8th round of the GATT. Now, as we talked about that, yes, in the Uruguay round, very discussions are arises, and they mainly can come up with the different kind of agreements. They are fixed agreements. So in the multilateral trade agreement, so in that final round of Uruguay, there were 14 agreement was created in the multilateral trade agreement and 4 was created in the polylateral trade agreement. So these 14 was discussed about all agriculture, sanitaries and phytosanitary measurements, textile and clothing, technical barriers to the trade. They discuss about trims, anti-dumping, customer valuation. These basically discussed about that how we can simplify the trades in all these different area, how we can make all the easiness in that practices. They come up with the all fixed rules and regulations in that particular agreements. And yes, at the same time, rule of origins must be there, import of licensing procedures, subsidies and countervailing measures, safeguard, GATT, TRIPS, dispute settlement, that all are in total 14, which basically agreements taken care. In polylateral trade agreement, yes, there were 4 major agreements which is taken care. That is international dairy product, that means bringing out the proper coordination in that. Trade in the civil aircraft, that is to minimize the tariffs in that particular importing the civil and art aircraft, and yes, bringing out the right practices in it. And public procurement is the one agreement, and yes, the international meat agreement is the one agreement in that particular trade. So this is what about the session. In this session, we will discuss about all the practices which are basically taken in that major round of GATT. That is what the Uruguay round, in which all the agreement, and there was a full-fledged new picture of international trade. So thank you and ignore.